Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you're calling in from anywhere in the world. My name is Michael. I'm from the Oxus Society for Central Asian Affairs, and we're here with another Twitter-based panel today focusing on the Taliban's relationship with Central Asia. And joining us today is a professor from the Davis Center at Harvard University, specializing in the relationship between Afghanistan and Central Asia, and that would be Suzanne Levi-Sanchez, who's an absolutely fantastic expert on this particular area of the world. Muhammed Tahir, who is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and a fantastic journalist covering Central Asia, a good friend of both Oxus and Twitter Spaces with us before. And Franz Marty, a journalist based in Kabul, reporting for everyone from DW to the Diplomat, and one of my favorite sources on the ground in Kabul. So I'm going to open with a question for Franz here. You've been in Kabul for quite a few years now. You've seen the Taliban come into power. You've seen the US leaving. How is this government different to the government that was in place before the Taliban, the US-backed government?
Thanks for the nice introduction. If we're talking towards the Central Asian republics, the main difference is probably that all the republic used to pay their bills to the Central Asian republics. The biggest difference for Tajikistan and Uzbekistan is that electricity that they now provide, the Taliban can't pay for. There are some rumors that some donors might or plan to pay. Apart from that, the biggest worry is, as for any other country, counterterrorism. So especially Tajikistan is worried about the Taliban hosting Islamist extremists from Tajikistan, especially in Badakhshan on the Afghan side, in northeastern Afghanistan. These extremists are few in numbers. One can argue how much threat they pose, but the Tajik government certainly is concerned about this. The Uzbek also to a lower level. Turkmenistan is really hard to tell because it's this weird dictatorship that is so closed off that at least I myself almost get no information out of there.
And Muhammad, obviously you're covering this area quite closely as well. How do you feel that the relationship has changed between Kabul and particularly Dushanbe and Tashkent? Things have got better, things have got worse. What has changed since the US have left and the Taliban's taken power in Kabul?
No, thank you very much, Michael, for this opportunity. And Frank nicely put it like, the former Afghan government used to pay its bills to Central Asia, very nicely put. But other than that, there are a couple of sides to the story, I guess. There is no doubt that the Taliban likes to be on good terms with everyone, given the isolation they are in. And from this perspective, Central Asia is no exception. Central Asia is more important, I guess, for the Taliban than any far in between countries, given they are next door neighbors. Also, the Taliban needs them as part of their efforts to gain external legitimacy. Taliban needs them as an economic partner. Central Asia is happy that there is a relative security in Afghanistan. Central Asia needs to also break its isolation. So a stable Afghanistan, regardless of the rulers, might offer some way out, some level of way out. It sounds like a win-win situation in some ways, but there are huge differences. The fundamental difference is the Taliban's ideology of being a Shariat religious-based system. It couldn't be more opposing to what Central Asian rulers want for their countries. On one hand, the Taliban wants to be in good terms, but on the other hand, as Frank was talking about, they continue to host ISIS members who are mostly of Central Asia origin in Afghanistan. Not only host them, but in some cases assign them into positions that are clearly directed to antagonize Central Asian authorities. For example, assigning the anti-government Tajik militants to security posts near the Afghan-Tajik border. Also, from the Central Asian perspective, a very drastic departure from the previous Afghan government is the rule of ethnic minorities in the current administration in Afghanistan. That is clearly, seeing something not positive from Central Asian perspective. Like in previous Afghan government, you had ethnic Uzbeks, Tajiks, and Hazaras as vice presidents, numerous ministers, governors, and top officials. But now there's no comparison. It might sound domestic, but it is not, when you look into this from Central Asia. Obviously, this is one of the main reasons why there is tension in the first place between the Tajikistani authorities and the Taliban, because Dushanbe thinks that the Taliban have completely sidelined ethnic Tajiks in Afghanistan from the government. Also, in the previous government, there were many cross-border activities that was going on beyond the exchange of delegations. I'm talking about people-to-people exchanges, exchanges between the same ethnic groups of the bordering areas between Central Asia and Afghanistan. It doesn't look like any such thing happening these days, at least on the level it used to be in the past. So there were actual regional projects going on involving Afghanistan. All seems to have been halted since the Taliban came to power. I do not see any actual hostilities per se between the neighbors, but I also do not see the previous atmosphere returning anytime soon between those two neighbors, I guess. The bottom line is that the governing structure is based on entirely opposing philosophies. It's hard to see any breakthrough the way things stands today.
So, Suzanne, one of your specialties is on Tajikistan, and obviously the tension between Tajikistan and Afghanistan is probably the coldest between the Central Asian republics. We've seen Afghanistan do things like stop Tajik trucks returning back over the border to Tajikistan. We've seen governments refusing to recognize each other. Why is there this much higher tension between Dushanbe and Kabul than, let's say, Kabul and Tashkent, or Kabul and Nur Sultan?
Yeah, I'm sure that Dr. Sanchez is going to add something into this, but just to start the conversation, I think there's a history, there's a basis for this tension. In the history, the basis for the tension being the fundamental mistrust between the Taliban and the authorities in Tajikistan. Obviously, there is a history. I said we know the Taliban hosting anti-government Tajik forces in their first time in the office back in 90s. The same thing is true for the Taliban when it comes to Tajikistan. They don't trust them either. The second thing is fundamentally opposing ideologies. What the Taliban wants is a strict religious government, and this is the last thing the Tajik government wants.
So we'll swing back to that toward the end, but I'm going to throw this question to Suzanne about sort of the policy focus on this one. Is effectively, why is the Taliban effectively stopping trucks getting back across the border and keeping the tensions between themselves and Dushanbe much higher on a government-to-government level than, let's say, their relationships with Nur Sultan or Bishkek or even Ashgabat?
I think there's several reasons. I think, Tajikistan jumped in quite early, saying that they were going to support the Tajik NRF, National Resistance Front, and they hosted some of their leaders. And then at the same time, Taliban allowed Jamaat Ansarullah to control 5 or 6 districts in the northern border, along the border of Tajikistan. And so that sort of started those tensions off right away. And then there was the issue of the helicopters that were in Tajikistan, or the aircraft, I should say, the aircraft that the Taliban viewed as belonging to them. And recently, the Tajik government sent more border troops to the Shamsuddin, formerly Shurabad area. So I do think there are some tensions, but I also think behind those tensions are a couple of things. On the Afghan side, there are 7 resistance groups. They're sort of small, large, all different sizes. There's 10 to 11 terrorist groups, many of them in the northern border. And I think that scares Tajikistan and the other countries, and each one is kind of developing different strategies on how to deal with these various threats to the other border, for the other side of the border. And it seems to me that there's also this undercurrent in which maybe trucks are stopped. I don't really know the backstory on that. I wish I did, because I do know the trafficking lanes are open, and those illicit trade lanes are open. And I do know China has put quite a bit of leverage on both the government, the Taliban government, as well as the Tajik government, to keep the Pamir highway flowing. So I don't think either the Taliban government or the Tajik government want to upset the China relationship. So to be honest with you, I'm a little confused as to why there would be this increased tension in terms of the cross-border trade when you do have sort of outside powers both funding and putting pressure on. On the other hand, again, you do have each side supporting the resistance groups to either side, and that continues. I hope that answered the question.
It does indeed. So just to throw this, we'll come back to you, Muhammed. I'm just going to throw this one to Franz first. And obviously, you've spent a lot of time in Kabul, and you're based in Kabul. One of the big, set stories that keeps coming up is that, as much as people don't like working with the Taliban, if it's not the Taliban, we are likely to see ISIS-K or other actors take power in Kabul. Being in Kabul at the moment, is there that genuine worry that ISIS-K or another, opposition group to the Taliban could take power if people refuse to work with or support the government inside Kabul?
I don't think you should look at this in this binary way. At the moment, I don't see any group being able to overthrow the Taliban. At most, some groups might be able to carve out small areas at some point, maybe even whole provinces. For example, the National Resistance Front controls some remote areas of Panjshir already. They might expand that. ISK has currently, and since late 2019, they don't hold any territory. With respect to ISK, it should also be remembered they are dangerous. They are considerable members of this group active in Afghanistan. They can stage attacks. They even did more or less failed rocket attacks, one against Tajikistan, one against Uzbekistan. Nonetheless, they remain a fringe group. So it's not like that they have now or in the foreseeable future, or in my assessment, even in the long-term future, they won't become this broad force that could take over Afghanistan. Nonetheless, saying that there's only that means you have to work together with the Taliban is, in my opinion, also short-sighted. You can also pressure the Taliban, or you can also disengage to a certain extent, or tell the Taliban that you only engage under certain conditions, which, I mean, it's just politics. So seeing this as we have to work together with the Taliban because otherwise it gets much worse, if this is the outlook, then I would say cooperating with the Taliban has also high risks, as was, for example, seen a few days ago when Al-Qaeda leader al-Zawahiri was killed in the middle of Kabul, which was hardly possible that he was there without the knowledge of the Taliban.
So, Muhammad, effectively, a lot of Central Asian states, particularly when we're looking at Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, have received rocket attacks from inside Afghan territory. Are the Central Asians getting worried that they might have to get more involved in the security in Afghanistan, or that we may see, further deployments of troops along the Uzbek border? How are Central Asian states reacting to this, and are they beefing up their security on the Afghan borders?
Again, when you look into ISIS, the presence of ISIS in northern Afghanistan, the opinions vary from the way they are seen from Kabul, and also the way they are seen from Central Asia. From Central Asian perspective, ISIS's presence in Afghanistan is not for Afghanistan because of Afghanistan. They are mostly made of Central Asian militants. They are hostile against Central Asian governments, leaders. Central Asian governments are seeing them as a threat. So ISIS is there for a reason from Central Asian perspective, and the reason being Central Asia, not Afghanistan. So you see, whenever you see those kind of rocket attacks, either failed or successful. At least we have seen two of them in the recent weeks. One against two against Uzbekistan, although the first one was a little controversial. But the second one was Uzbek authorities even admitted that there was a indeed rocket attack from Afghanistan. So in one to Tajikistan. So whenever those kind of signs, whenever those kind of attacks occurs by the ISIS militants in Afghanistan towards Central Asia. These are kind of confirmation of what they think ISIS is for in Central Asia. And from their perspective, without Taliban giving them green light, they cannot be in Afghanistan. Without Taliban's knowledge, they won't be staging attacks here and there against Central Asian authorities. So I don't think, in some ways, at least looking into this from Tajikistan's perspective, so they cannot see them differently from each other. And in the same way, like, when you see Tajikistan hosting those anti-Taliban forces in Dushanbe, Taliban see them in the same way, that they cannot be there without the blessing of the Tajik authorities. So the hostility is very open. And that leads to occasionally, closure of the borders. That leads to war of words, and then that leads to kind of mass mobilization of forces just across the border, in both sides, on the Taliban side and also on the Central Asian sides. I think this little mistake could lead to something big.
If I may.
Yep, jump in.
If I may to add something here, just to caveat, because there's a lot about ISK is everywhere in Afghanistan and so on, I would just be caution about this. I mean, I travel around the country, and most of the time it's more complex than most reports suggest. So in northern Afghanistan, the only place with a confirmed somehow ISK presence I know of is in Kunduz. There are some ISK members in Imam Sahib. but it's weird because like I'm pretty sure, I mean, I know some by name, they are around, but it's not really clear how much they are doing. Some attacks that they claim there also suggest rather that they can't do much. For example, like knife attacks, when you have to ask yourself if they can't even get a gun. So there we have ISK members, but if or what they are doing and how strong they are is like a huge question mark. The other place with potential ISK presence is in Faryab, Rormach, which is on the border to Badris, but there it's like very murky, and we're talking about mostly people that hail from Uzbekistan and that have been in weird places a long time, potentially also former IMU member. Azizi Oldosh was killed there in late 2020, if I remember correctly. And then you have also like just these weird reports. For example, in Badakhshan, since 2016, people in Badakhshan, well-placed sources tell me that there is like Daesh ISK around and they will announce their presence soon. And since 2016, now almost 7 years, nothing ever happens. You have never any clear indication for this. So it looks like that this is just like wrong attribution. Sometimes it also gets exaggerated. What was mentioned before by other speakers, that a member of Jamaat Ansarullah, Media Salon, is in charge of 5 districts at the border to Tajikistan. I don't know where this exactly comes from, but on the Afghan side, there's practically no clear information about Media Salon. According to my sources, he sits somewhere in Darwaz, but that he's actually in charge of 5 border districts is something that I find highly questionable, unless someone could tell me that there are factual indications for this on the Afghan side, which I have never seen. So with all these reports, I would just to caution, yes, there is a threat there, but also to caution to take a step back and like rethink how much and what exactly are we talking about.
Wait,
So we'll jump
I
back.
have a
We'll jump back.
question about
back
that. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to
May
say,
I?
Suzanne, can you sort of clarify this, because your expertise and what you've been focusing on a lot recently is Ghor-e-Badakhshan. That's right on the border with Afghanistan. You know, can you take on what Franz has just told us, and maybe even talk about is there any involvement by any of these groups inside Ghor-e-Badakhshan, as some people in Dushanbe may have claimed?
Oh, yeah, definitely not. No involvement right now in Gorno-Badakhshan from these groups. That's for sure. These groups will not cooperate with the Ismailis at all. That's one thing. In terms of the 5 districts, for me, that's both discussions with people I know on the ground, as well as I have many sources there too, but I'm not on the ground like Frank is, so I can't compete with that, but I do have many sources there who tell me things. And I also cited, I think, Long War Journal had quite a report on it, on that leadership there. My question is, if Jamaat Ansarullah is not there, as has been reported and reported to me, then does that mean the Taliban actually has consolidated power? Because I heard about 6 months back that they had consolidated power along the border, and then I heard the opposite, and it kind of went back and forth. So I'd be very curious about that consolidation. And in terms of the sort of minor terrorist groups and whatnot, I think the challenge there is, while ISK might have a minor presence, I think they're actively recruiting. And from what I read recently, is some of the Uyghur militants were offered more money to fight for ISK versus working with the Taliban. And the Taliban has ensured that these different, resistance groups and militant groups and terrorist groups will not breach the border, and that they will be in control. They've also assured China that the Uyghurs won't breach the Chinese border or cause problems over there. And they did move a group, from what I understand, that could be incorrect information too, but I think it is correct, further into Afghanistan. In terms of Gorno-Badakhshan, though, the recent reporting about some kind of intergroup fighting or whatever. That just wasn't the case. That was the Tajik government fighting with the local leaders and really had no cross-border anything. And from my contacts in Badakhshan, on the eastern parts of Badakhshan, they actually are feeling, many of them, that while there are some restrictions from the Taliban government and the higher level leadership positions are being, you know, populated by all Taliban, they actually have quite a bit of local leadership control still, including the Shura are still operating, at least in Wakhan, Ishkashim, and the various humanitarian efforts are going through these shuras. Some of the AKDN programs and Aga Khan Foundation programs have been more limited in the past, but they are still continuing. And the Taliban presence is very minor, except for along the border, at which points they are controlling, but there is not like there used to be with the former government, where there was a lot of cross-border exchanges, there were NGO exchanges, there were best practices. There's a lot less of that, if any of that, going on. And that is pretty hard on the Afghan population there because of the limited cross-border cooperation. And frankly, also limited cross-border security cooperation that used to go on there as well.
Yeah. Michael, can I go back to a little bit the earlier question you had? Yeah, since you asked about the ISIS, so I was very much focused in my answer to ISIS. But, you know, other than ISIS, we know there are Jundullahs, there are remnants of IMUs, there are Jamaat Ansarullah in those bordering areas. And, our sources tell us, and also sources from both sides of the border, like, you know, I was, I left Radio for Radio Liberty recently, but there is an active Tajik service within Radio for Radio Liberty, and they have sources just across the border. In Tajikistan, they are saying that, there are reporting about the presence of Tajikistani Tajik militant groups in Badakhshan, for example. And Taliban don't deny that either. So they can, from the Tajik side, you can literally see their post, and there is this shouting match takes place between the Tajik border forces and the militants just across the border in Afghanistan occasionally, the way the Tajik from there. So what I'm saying is, like, in terms of presence of those Tajikistan, not Central Asian militant groups, be it under the name of ISIS, be it under the name of IMU, Jundullah, Jamaat Ansarullah, whatever, they are present in certain number of places in the bordering areas of Afghanistan. They've been reported. There have been lots.
Well, let's zoom out a bit and look at it a bit from a bit wider region and talk about some of the other players here. Obviously we have the Indians who have an air force base. We have the Chinese who have border patrol posts across the Afghan border. The Russians have still got the 191st, the 92nd, and the 149th mechanized regiments sitting in Tajikistan at the moment. If things do start to destabilize inside Afghanistan, are we likely to see any of these, Chinese, Indian, or Russian deployments inside Tajikistan going in to effectively either help stabilize the situation or keep governments in place, or frankly, those border posts and those troops sitting in Tajikistan are just designed to stop people from Afghanistan leaving the country into Central Asia? What's your feeling on that, Muhammed?
Let me invite Dr. Sanchez on that.
Okay, I'm happy to answer that. Reading the tea leaves, because that's a difficult one. I think that from the strategy of the great powers on the outside, or India, China, Russia, I think the goal is twofold. One, definitely keep any militants out of their from crossing the borders. I think that's very clear from what I've read and understood and spoken to different people about. China has made that very, very clear. That's one thing. But I think that China in particular, as well as India, would like to find ways to increase trade and exchanges so that there's a stable Afghanistan. You can see that with Uzbekistan's strategy is very much encompassing that. And I think that, the question of would they actually go into Afghanistan is a really important one. I do think that Chinese presence inside Afghanistan, as well as meetings with the Taliban government on security issues, has been fairly robust from what I can gather. And I think Russia has had some involvement too, but they are a little distracted at the moment, obviously, with Ukraine. And I think India has had its own set of talks. So whether they actually directly engage or they simply provide the mechanisms to be able to strengthen the Taliban security forces to stop these groups, I think there's a strong motivation to do so. And I had one more point on that, which is I think that when there were recent semi-rocket attacks or whatever they were into Uzbekistan and all of that happened, and there were reports of Uzbek planes flying into Afghanistan to monitor that without a huge outcry from the Taliban government about it. At least I didn't hear of one. It does seem like there might be also a slightly more permissive environment along that border to be able to stabilize it. I could be reading that wrong, but in order to placate and assure these funders like China or India or Russia that they can control it and they will partner to control it to make that happen. If that would be my take on that.
So
If I may,
oh yeah, I was going
to may add one thing. I obviously can't say, but I would just remind, for example, I know people in the Russian embassy. I don't know about right now, but until recently, they had people there that were stationed there during the 80s. I know a senior Uzbek diplomat who has been stationed in the Soviet embassy in Kabul in the 80s. So on the Russian side, sometimes also on the Central Asian side, there are still quite a few people around who remember what happened in the 80s when the Soviet Union was in Afghanistan. So I would say the threshold that they would go in would be really high. because the West might have more or less forgotten that in Russia and in Central Asia, it looks a little bit different.
Just one line, though. I also kind of agree on that with Franz. I mean, instead of talking about those big regional powers like China and Russia, instead of they going into Afghanistan, they would, I believe, rather try to pressure the Taliban to do something about those kind of threats that might require them to go into Afghanistan. And they know the Taliban, if they want, they can control this. They can. I guess that's my take on that.
I completely agree with both of you on that.
So I'm going to throw this one to Franz. Having spent enough time in Kabul, you can see some investment coming into the place. Effectively, governments are starting to build or manufacture things, or even put some work inside Kabul. The Uzbek government particularly has put their power grid and connected it to the Afghan power grid. On the ground, though, are people noticing, the Uzbek investments or the Chinese investments, or even, the Russian investments? Is there any actual evidence to the day-to-day citizen living in Kabul that other powers are taking an interest in Afghanistan, or that Central Asians are, welcoming Afghanistan into the community that is Central Asia?
No, or I'm not aware of it. There are some Chinese businessmen, apparently a lot, that have come into Kabul. We usually don't see them, sometimes in some propaganda photo from the Taliban. But honestly, most of the time it looks more like it's some minor Chinese businessmen that think they can pull off something. It is usually also more on the shady side. Same with Russian businessmen. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, the Chinese government even explicitly told Chinese businessmen to not go to Afghanistan because it's too dangerous still. So there is a lot of exaggeration in this regard. Usually on small projects, small investment, no one talks about. So there it's hard to say how much, maybe a little bit comes in, but I would dare to say it's limited. Certainly not enough to stabilize the economy, who has been tanking since the Taliban takeover inside Afghanistan. And the big projects, I mean, there it's also hard to tell. As the other speakers on the panel probably know well better than I do. I mean, Tapis, Termez, Mazar, Kabul, Peshawar Railroad, Kaza 1000 electricity line from Kyrgyzstan through Tajikistan to Afghanistan. All these projects, they are around, most of them since decades. And like, if you go back, you can Google this. Every 2, 3, 5 years, there is some report, there is the breakthrough, and now it will begin and it will transform the region, and then it never comes. So Tapi's around since the 90s. It hasn't materialized so far under the current circumstances, especially politically, also with the latest strike that will probably make the Taliban again more of a pariah. It's hard to see how any of this should materialize in a significant way to actually transform the region, at least in the foreseeable future.
So, Suzanne, I'm going to throw this one to you. A stable Afghanistan could be very beneficial to Central Asia, particularly pipelines like the Tapi pipeline that would go connect Turkmenistan's gas fields to the demanding markets of India and Pakistan. That would be huge for the region. That getting them access to the sort of the Indian and Pakistani markets would be great. So should these Central Asian countries be looking to put more money or more effort or starting to help stabilize Afghanistan? or frankly, if Russia couldn't do it, if America couldn't do it, if the British couldn't do it, it was just stabilizing Afghanistan is just too hard a task for probably the Central Asian governments to be able to achieve?
Well, I think as was said right at the beginning of the program, I think I think I can't remember if Muhammad or Frank said so. I apologize, but that they have just such completely different ideological sort of functions that the thought of Central Asian governments or Taliban being willing to let Central Asian governments come in to help stabilize the country, I just not I don't think that is going to happen. But I think the benefit to Central Asia for all of these things to occur is huge.
I'm talking more about sort of, for instance, Kazakh telecom companies or Uzbek, manufacturing companies setting up shop inside Afghanistan where labor is cheap and effectively putting foreign direct investment into the country, less than military troops.
I apologize. Okay, so I think that I think what Frank said about these pipelines and all of these different projects that have been discussed I've also, every time it comes up, everybody gets excited, and then it just kind of nothing happens. If it happens this time for some reason, I think I could imagine every single Central Asian country, if well, I don't know about Tajikistan, but the others would be thrilled to be able to set up foreign direct investment if the foreign direct investment could be safely invested in the country. I think there's been discussion about this Mazar Peshawar railway, and then that going to China, or some kind of route into China. I could imagine China with its Belt Road Initiative trying to aggressively fund that, but currently there really isn't enough stability in the country for, and in my opinion, for these businesses to be set up, because regardless of how tiny these little resistance groups or whatever they are, they're still there.
Yeah.
And those are huge targets if they come into the country, and it gives ISIS-K a whole recruiting opportunity, or any other group, to say, look, they're partnering with all these outside countries, and so they become targets. I'm sorry that's not a very clear answer, but I think the benefit for the region, I wrote about that in 2010 with working with the UN. So I think the benefit would be huge. It's just really somehow hasn't been materializing. But I like the way Uzbekistan has been really trying to engage very sort of proactively in this cross-border trade issues.
So, Muhammad, obviously the governments might have a bit of hesitancy, looking long-term into projects in Afghanistan. But what about the sort of private business sector inside the Central Asian states? Do you think we might see private investment or private funds from Central Asian companies and Central Asian investors heading into Afghanistan?
There are two things on that, Michael. One is private sector is not hugely developed in Central Asia. That's the first thing. The second thing is, even if there are some, which are usually connected to the authorities, to the government, to the leadership there. So without any clear signal from the authorities, I am not sure if they are going to move into Afghanistan and do anything, make any major investment. But on the other hand, there were the projects that we have been talking about for the past decades, like at TAPI. In the first time when the Taliban was in power, even then it was at least on paper it was so close to realization, and then Taliban government was collapsed, and then everything kind of was pushed into the back door. But as soon as Taliban came back to power, Turkmenistan is one of the first places they went. The Taliban sent delegation, and Turkmenistan's foreign minister was in Afghanistan, mainly talking about TAPI project, which, if realized, will bring Turkmen gas from Turkmenistan through Afghanistan to Pakistan and possibly India. It's a huge project, and it's a lifeline for Turkmenistan in some ways. Like otherwise, Turkmenistan, despite sitting on a huge gas reserves, it cannot sell its gas to Europe because simply there is no way. they cannot send it through Caspian Sea. They cannot build this pipeline through Caspian Sea because of the opposition by Iran and Russia. And alternatively, they are just stuck with China. China remains to be the only source where they sell the gas. So they desperately need alternatives. So if it works out with the Taliban, they definitely want to come back to the project, to Tapi. And the same thing with Uzbekistan, especially in this context when Russia is bogged down on so many fronts and being announced as a pariah in some ways by the Western, world. And Uzbekistan wants alternative routes to do trade, to do business with outside world beyond Russia. So Afghanistan certainly, in the ideal scenario, offers that alternative route to Uzbekistan. That's why there's a huge effort by the Uzbek authorities to kind of bring Taliban and the outside world together, start some sort of engagement, between these two, kind of groups, and then hoping that something comes out of that. And the same thing, Tajikistan's economy is in a bad shape.
Sure.
There was a conversation that Tajikistan would sell electricity through Afghanistan to Pakistan. If there would have been an opportunity, Tajikistan would like to do that as well. But Taliban remaining a pariah kind of administration or nation or state, it is hard for Central Asia to take the initiative to do something on their own. So there has to be kind of broader movement for that to happen. Central Asians to come and do something with the Taliban-run government there.
So
Can I add one tiny thing? The reason I was talking about businesses and the state is because they're really not separated from the state, like Muhammed said. And I think that, Tajikistan just nationalized a bunch of businesses on their side of the border. So you're not going to have sort of independent business people from at least several of the countries. They're going to be part of the state business, similar to the way China does it to an extent, only more so. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Of course.
Yeah.
So we are running right up against time at the moment. So we're going to just do a quick wrap around with 60 seconds for each of you. And I'm going to throw Franz this question first. But effectively, in 60 seconds, where do you see the relationship between the Taliban and Central Asia going? Will it be a state on the fringe that is an afterthought? Will it be an important partner? Is it where do you see that relationship developing?
Well, nowhere good. I think Tajikistan already doesn't want to collaborate with the Taliban due to ideological reasons, due to the Tajik militants on the border. Uzbekistan is engaging, but I guess they also realize more and more that the Taliban are difficult to work with, that they don't keep their promises, and that they host extremists that might become a problem in the future. Turkmenistan, again, it's so sealed off, I can't really say. But I guess it will be rather going towards a relation to a pariah state, which the Taliban will become.
Suzanne, same question. Where do you see the relationship between the Taliban and Central Asia developing?
It could go one of two ways. If the Taliban, with outside power assistance, can control some of these insurgent groups and also consolidate their power without upsetting the minority groups as much as they are, then some relations and increased trade relations could occur. And I think that a number of outside powers will support that aggressively. So there's an incentive to do that. On the other hand, if they can't control these other groups and they continue to consolidate power and upset these other groups, which then increases the sort of chaotic shattering of a ability of the government to control the state, then, as Frank said, I agree, then it becomes more and more of a pariah state. And then the strategy of the Central Asian governments will be simply to control those borders and then get what they can out of it. I think that I'm going to bring up the multi-billion-dollar drug trade in both meth and heroin and opioids. That continues to flow. So there will be partnerships one way or another across that border, because I don't think that's going to suddenly stop. I do think there's two really vastly different potentials there, and it'll probably be some mix of in between.
And Muhammed, to finish us off, 60 seconds, where do you think the relationship between Central Asia and the Taliban is going?
I will keep an eye on two fronts. One is, on domestically in Afghanistan, how the Taliban is going to treat those militant groups that are, a matter of concern for some of the Central Asian countries. The second thing is a matter of inclusivity in the Afghan government, whether Taliban will stick where it is now, which will continue to, remain source of tension between the Taliban and the Central Asian governments, because, the fact being that most of the, government officials of the Taliban are Pashtuns, the ethnic groups are being sidelined. The third thing is, on a broader kind of regional picture, I will keep an eye on where the Taliban and Russian relationship goes beyond that, because that might determine the thinking among Central Asian authorities how to go with how to go about their own kind of discussions or relationship with the Taliban.
So thank you so much for everyone who tuned in for this this Twitter space on the Taliban's relationship with Central Asia. It's been an absolute pleasure to be here tonight. Remember, Oxus has a podcast called Spotlight on Central Asia if you want to check out the latest news from the region. We will be back doing another Twitter space in probably a week and a bit, focusing on the increase in the recent Kazakh military budget. But I want to give a big thanks to Suzanne Levi-Sanchez, a tenured professor and professor at the Davis Center at Harvard, specializing in the relationship between Afghanistan and Central Asia. Muhammed Tahir, a resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and a fantastic analyst focusing on Central Asia. And the always amazing Franz Marty, a journalist based in Kabul who has reported for everyone from DW to the Diplomat. Thanks to all of you for listening. Thanks to our panelists for jumping on this one, and I will see you at the next one. Have a good night.